Hello and welcome to a RackForms training video. In this episode, edition, whatever we want to call it, we are going to be building PDFs. And the output that we're getting looks a little something like this. We have a 2-page PDF document that has a first page, which is meant to be just sort of like a cover page. Notice it goes to edge, and the second page then has a PDF where we have some text overlaid on top of a PDF background right here. And these items right here would be a representation of dynamic text. So this would be whatever the user filled in earlier in your form. So that's our general output right there. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing that we need to do when we're working with PDFs and RackForms, and by the way, we're building this from scratch, so we're just gonna literally delete these two guys, show you how it's done. The first thing that we need to do is we do need, of course, a source PDF. Now, there are a lot of diverging paths in this process, and this is definitely one of the first ones. So in this particular case, we are focusing on where we're generating a PDF, where we're going to probably have, or in this case, we definitely have, but you will probably have something that you put in the background. So it could just be a logo. It could be a page that has like the blank areas of where the PDF responses would go. Maybe it has a cover page like we have here. You have a PDF that has full page images as backgrounds. And that's why we have this second page right here to represent an area where you might have little lines where the user in the PDF version of the form would have put in information. And so that is the first thing that we need is a PDF as a source. Now, one of the things about this process, as I always like to say, is as much of an art as it is a science. And you're going to see a little bit of that as we're going through here today. But on the science front, there is generally one number that we really do care about, regardless of how we're building this, and that is DPI, or dots per inch. Now, in order to better see dots per inch, I'm using a program called Affinity Publisher. And Affinity Publisher is this nice program, runs both Mac and Windows. It's incredibly well priced, but it allows us to either open PDFs or generate documents which will become PDFs, and then see that very important property, that DPI. And to get to it, I'm going to go into a menu item called Document Setup, and here you can see next to Document Units, we have DPI again. It has a value. So what is DPI? So this is just dots per inch, or as you might think of it in more modern terms, pixels per inch. And what it simply means is that over a given width, so a physical width, in this case measured in inches, we have a certain number of dots per inch that make up our image. And by way of reference, if you've ever had a, let's say like an inkjet printer print something out for you, like a very old one, you may have had like 150 dots per inch. If you pick up a professional printed magazine, you're going to have something around like 200 to 300. And if you've ever used a laser printer to print off something, you'll notice text is really crisp. Well, that's usually around 1200 pixels per inch. So obviously the type of content you're printing will determine a lot of times what the pixels per inch is, but the general rule of thumb is if you're ever printing something to the page, you need at least 144 or higher. And if it's something that's just displayed on a computer screen, you can get away with 72 or 96. So a lot of this dimension here, and a lot of this measurement unit has to do with what the final output of your PDF is. However, there's a caveat to this, which is that when you're talking about dots per inch, the higher the number, the bigger the file size you have. And the bigger the file size you have, oftentimes, especially on servers that are memory constrained or CPU constrained, it's going to be much harder to generate those PDFs to the point where you could just literally freeze up your server for a little while or take an extraordinarily long time on the client side as you're generating the PDF. So a lot of this unit here is you experimenting. That's where the art comes in, where you basically, depending on the number of pages that are in your PDF, depending on the output quality, depending on the output destination, whether it's printed or just going to be saved in somebody's PDF folder on their hard drive, you want to experiment with these values. But generally speaking, the number I would start with is 96. So as you're working with PDFs and you're creating background images, use 96 as a starting value. With that said then, again, I have two main pages that I am going to sort of care about as far as the RackForms part, this first page and the second page. Two quick things I'll note about this is notice how in this document we have this sort of light line right here. This just represents the page dimension. And notice critically how my background image is going right to the edge of the page. So on the PDF version of this, I would expect that there's no gaps at all. And the same can be said for the second page, where this is a little bit black, or I should say this is pure black, this is a little bit dark gray. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can see that thin line right there. That's our page dimension. Notice once again how the black is going right up to the edge. So we don't expect any gaps on the top or the side of this document right here. So with that said, then we're going to basically export both these pages. I've already done that, but in this case, through this Affinity Publisher program, I hit Shift-Option-Command-S, and I've exported the two individual pages as PNGs. Now, we have lots of different file formats we could choose from, but typically either use JPEG or PNG, preferably PNG, especially if you have a lot of like solid lines or text. It's going to be a lot sharper usually than the JPEG will be. And the rest of these formats pretty much ignore. Again, this is just this program, but we wouldn't be able to support EXR, HDR, TGA, etc. So usually you should have a PNG or a JPEG at 96 dpi to go. The one quick thing I'll note about this, lastly, before we get into RackForms, is notice this number right here, 816 pixels by 1056 pixels. If we grab our calculator here and we are to take 816 divided by 96, we're going to get 8.5. And if we grab 1056 divided by 96, we're going to get 11. So 8.5 and 11. What does that sound like? Well, if you're in the US, that's US Lender standard spec. So hopefully that, if you haven't kind of thought of that yet, hopefully that ties that together. This image that we are exporting here is on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. It's 96 dpi, but if you take the total pixels and divide it by its dots per inch, that's what its physical size will be. And we don't really have to care about the physical size in RackForms, but it is important that if your final destination is supposed to be an 8.5 by 11 document, you should probably be having at minimum these dimensions. And again, generally speaking, something that's 96 dpi or thereabouts so that it looks nice when you actually export it. So with that said, then let's turn our attention to RackForms. So I now have these two PNG images that we want to convert into a PDF in RackForms. So the first step I'm going to do is I'm going to add a form page. I'm going to go, by the way, pretty fast this first time. Then we'll do it a second time just so you can see it with all the details. But I'm going to add a form page. I'm going to delete the default element. I'll add a bucket, an image, and then the image as its source is going to get one of those image items. In this case, then, you'll notice that the image is actually pretty wide. However, as you recall, 816, right? That's its pixel dimension. Sure enough, if I make my document 816, you notice the edge of my PDF goes right to the edge right here. By default, RackForms will add styles to images. We don't want that here, so I'll delete the extra field style. And if I now run this page, you'll notice that the image looks pretty good. We got a bit of a gap right here. So if I go to my page settings and select page margin and set to 0, you'll notice now that I got rid of about half of it. We still have a little bit left over right here. And if we are to export this as a PDF, you'll notice that the PDF is mostly good. Again, we got this margin. We're going to be taking care of this in a second, so ignore this for now. But you'll notice here that the image at least goes across an entire 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. So that's good. So let's deal with this gap right now. And let's talk about this in a little bit more detail. So I'm actually just going to delete my page, and let's kind of start over here and go through the process a little bit more detail. So again, delete that guy, we'll add a bucket. So why are we adding a bucket? Well, if you've used RackForms before, a bucket is a container for other elements. And the key thing for us is that buckets can layer items on top of them using any position that we want. And that is absolutely critical for PDF generation in those cases, specifically for the second page, where I'm going to have a image background that sort of shows the elements of like, well, hey, this is where your name would have gone. And then we're going to overlay that, depending on where we want to put items, with display elements in RackForms. So the background serves to sort of like act as the template, and then in RackForms, we're going to layer items on top of it to act as the information for that PDF. Now, in this first page here, again, we just added an image, and that image, when we remove the style, actually, I'll leave this so you can see this in a second, but this image right here, it doesn't have anything that layers on top of it. So you don't need to worry about z-indexing like we will in the second one. So for this one, it's pretty simple. If I build this form real quick, you'll notice here's that border. It's probably a little bit hard to see, but there's just a little bit of a padding and a border right there. So when we get rid of that border, you'll notice now that we have really just a gap. That's the only thing that's left, because when we display as a PDF, that's the only thing that's on there. So here's how we then actually convert this into an actual PDF. So you'll notice that before I went into my page and I removed my page margin right here, there's a much simpler way of doing this. Basically select the page, go to my PDF options, and just underneath page PDF output properties, go ahead and click this apply full page CSS to page JavaScript / CSS. And this is going to do really one thing. It's just added this bit of CSS to my page JavaScript section right here. And you'll notice that when I did that, this image sort of shrunk down right here, which makes it much easier now to deal with this image. But what actually happened here? Well, if we look at the CSS right here, it's done a couple things. So first, it's removed all margins from my HTML body. That is now why if I run this, it no longer has a margin right there. That's good. It's also told any images to have a width of auto. And because my width is sitting within this bucket, if I make my page 816 pixels wide, and if I drag this guy out now to semi-close to that, I don't have to be perfect at all, but just get it kind of close. When I run this PDF now, it does exactly what we want. It goes right up to the edges right here, both on the left and right-hand side, and the top and the bottom, as you can see right there. So that's exactly what we want. So that's pretty much all we need to do for that first page. I am going to drag the margins of this bucket out a little bit, because the second step now is to add additional pages to my form. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my page settings and back under page PDF output properties, and I'm going to click the guy just below the one we just clicked, which is add portrait PDF page rake to page. And what this is going to do is it's going to add this little code block that contains a div that has a style that the CSS rendering engine, the PDF rendering engine, understands as a command to generate a new page. So previously, we just had one page in this PDF. Now we actually have two. If we look at our scroll bar here, here's my first page, and there's now a second page. Now to populate the second page with content, close a few of these windows, all I need to do is once again add another bucket and add my image to the bucket. Select the source for the image. In this case, we'll grab page 2. And now because we've applied that style, that is, we went to PDF and we clicked apply full page styles, now you'll notice that this image was the exact same size as the first one, but now everything is just being, its width is set to auto. And so now you just get this beautiful behavior where you just drag it out to approximately where we want it. And again, if I run this PDF now, you should see that the second page is pretty close to what we want. We have a border, which is that extra style. We have a gap up top, and to fix that, we're simply going to select our image, delete the extra field style attribute, and we're going to drag this image up, usually 2 clicks, so that it goes right to the top of the page, just like this. And that's pretty much it. This then would be the basic process, which you then just repeat for every additional page that you need in your form. Now, as we mentioned before, however, at this point, we do have some additional items that we want to layer on top of it. So how does that actually work? Well, luckily it's pretty simple. If I drag my image down here, and actually let's just, to keep things clean, we'll go ahead and drag this bucket out again so that it kind of encompasses the whole item. If I basically drag my image down here, I can add the elements that I want to apply to this item. For example, body copy item. So go ahead and add this body copy item, add a second body copy item, and we have 3 fields, so add 1 more. And now what I can basically do is I can layer these. So layering is really a 2-step process. The first step is to note here that these items may not be on top of the background image that we created. Now, because we created these guys after I added the image, they are by definition on top. But if you ever have a layering issue, all you got to do is select the element in question and set its z-index element to a number that's higher than the background image. So z-index is just what layer position are you? Lower numbers are lower, higher numbers are higher. You'll notice that everything is 1 right now, but that's because I created these guys afterwards. But I could, for example, set this guy to 0 or actually I could set this guy to 1, and I could set my image here to 2. And notice that when I do that, these guys now fell behind this element. So the one big trick here is that when you're working with these items, always set your background image as a z-index of 1. And generally speaking, as long as you create your background image first and you display items second, all these items will just automatically place on top of it, so you can just quickly grab them. But if you ever run into an issue where you can't grab them, you simply want to make sure that the items that you created have a higher z-index value than your background image. Now with that done, then we're pretty much ready to display this. So here at same body copy, I could say Matthew Grudinick. And if I run this PDF, scroll down to my second page, we should see that the item is placing exactly where it expected to on my document, just underneath right there. Now again, art, science, we're gonna wanna go those 2 clicks up right here. And because of that, we're gonna wanna move these guys up. But we should have something that is now pretty easy to go ahead and populate with the elements in the places that you want. And again, to add more pages, we simply replace or repeat that last step. We'd have our document. Again, we go to our page options. So I click the header here, I go to PDF, and I say add portrait PDF page break. Adds another page break. If I run this document, notice now we have page 1, page 2, and once again, a free page where we can now add another bucket and elements within there to create the items that we want. Finally, the last thing I'll say, and this hopefully goes without saying, but just in case, just because we've been using full page background images right here, doesn't mean that your document has to have that at all. So for example, I could add a bucket, select it and add a bucket to my page right here. There is no rule that says that I need to actually have to have a background image. If, for example, your PDF just has, let's say, a logo on the top of the page, it's almost certainly going to be easier just to save that logo as an image and then just populate that logo where the image item goes, and then just use body text items or even things like input text fields to basically build out your template like this right here. So there's nothing that says that we need background images. It's just that usually having a background image is going to save you a ton of time because somebody's already taken the time to build out a PDF file that has all the elements laid exactly where you want them. And your job is just to put content on top of that. And this is the way that you can do that, again, right here, but nothing says that it has to be that way. It could also just be a logo and simple elements that we display elsewhere. So that is our look at PDF creation in RackForms. Just to kind of hit the major points again, we have a bucket. We usually put an image within the bucket, and then we have some helper commands by selecting our page, clicking on PDF, and going to Page, PDF Output Properties, where we most importantly apply full page CSS JavaScript, and then add our page breaks if we happen to have more than one page break. And then of course the last item is that dots per inch. You'll notice here that as I'm building, even on my relatively fast machine, when I add an additional page or additional pages to this document, every time I do that, it starts getting a little bit slower. So you do want to make sure that the dots per inch that you set for your background images is as low as it can possibly be without looking terrible, because your output properties are going to be way easier when you do that. So questions, comments, as always, please drop us a line, let us know.